right. Welcome to Black Mental Health Matters. My name is Elsa. I'll be the host of today's show. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Today, I have two very special guests on a very interesting topic, dyslexia and learning disabilities with respect to mental health, especially for Black communities. So I'm very excited for today's show. So I'm going to talk a little bit about who you guys are. Clarissa Grissom, you are a speaker and an advocate who holds a bachelor's in psychology, and you'll also be graduating this May with a master's in speech language pathology. You were recently inducted into the Phi Kappa Phi Professional Honor Society, which is amazing, to acknowledge your academic achievements and your master's program. You also consider yourself a learner for life and enjoys educating both yourself and those in your community. So that's amazing. And Hodan Ali, whom I also know, you are a nurse educator. You're an activist, a community coordinator, community helper within the Ottawa area. You're also an environmentalist, and you continue to educate yourself further by going back to school, which is amazing. So welcome to the show. So if you can tell me a little bit about yourselves, where you're located, what you do, and why you do what you do. So I guess I'll start with you, Clarissa.
Sure. Thank you for having me today. So as Elsa mentioned, I'm Clarissa Grissom. I currently reside in Dallas, Texas, where I am a graduate student studying speech language pathology. And currently I am working in the public schools providing intervention services for children with different language disabilities.
Oh, that's amazing. All right, Hodan, tell us a little bit about you, where you're located, and why you do what you do.
Yeah, Elsa already explained pretty much what I do. I'm a nurse as well as a nurse educator for a local college in the city of Ottawa, where I've grown up most of my life, and also in touch with a lot of close friends as well as community members that are deal with community outreach, especially in minority communities, as well as newcomers to Canada. So yeah, being in the healthcare field background, it's not unusual for friends or family or neighbors to come up to you whenever they have questions. So it's given me an opportunity to educate myself and research more on a lot of the different topics that are out there and be aware of some of the things that impact a lot of people, including my own personal students that I've had experience with. So it's been a very interesting roller coaster as a whole, as an educator as well. So yes.
That's amazing. I mean, I could definitely understand in terms of like community support. So it's nice that people can come to you, especially as a nurse and as a nurse educator with that knowledge as well. And I'm sure that's also applicable to you, Clarissa. And yeah, welcome to both of you. Two great minds from two different disciplines, but it's also within the realm of healthcare. So very similar. So I'm very happy to be having this type of discussion with you, especially on dyslexia and learning disabilities, which is something that's often I think in marginalized communities, that's not as discussed as it is in mental health services or in services for that matter for these disabilities. So I guess my first question is to both of you. Do you think dyslexia and learning disability is common among Black communities?
Definitely, I do think that it does exist in all communities overall. Access to care and access to getting assessed for learning disabilities, however, may vary from one community to the next. I believe that unfortunately there's like a double-edged sword where there may be certain people who are marginalized who unfortunately either don't get the proper diagnosis and don't get the proper support they need. Equally, there are also people of color who unfortunately get mislabeled or misdiagnosed due to racial biases that exists in the world that we live in, unfortunately. According to the International Dyslexia Association, 15 to 20% of population has a language-based learning disability. So dyslexia is actually very common. But even though it's common, it's still not underdiagnosed, and even affecting people, I think, of like disparaged communities a lot more, unfortunately, than that of, you know, people who might have a bit more access to different type of services or higher socioeconomical status.
So kind of echoing what was already said, so in the United States, I know that 1 in 5 children have a learning disability. And so learning disabilities certainly do impact our Black community, but it is kind of hard to tease apart the exact percentage of children in the Black community that have a learning disability, because there is an issue with misidentification of Black students with learning disabilities. Sometimes children with learning disabilities may be labeled as having some sort of behavioral challenge, when in reality they may be expressing frustration due to struggling in the classroom.
Yeah, I mean, that's a definitely interesting perspectives and very similar perspectives from both of you, which leads me to the second question, because there is also the the idea that it could be mislabeled when it could have been diagnosed properly, especially for amongst like Black children, like you said, or Black people. So the confluence of race and dyslexia, I think, even learning disabilities, is almost non-existent, I believe, in Black communities. And so in that sense, that have any of you came across any intersectional research or cross-sectional research that accounts for learning disabilities and dyslexia among marginalized communities, or is there a lack of research in that sense?
So I would say that in general, there is a lack of research. However, there are some studies. The Learning Disability Association of America actually compiled different research studies from multiple organizations that kind of explore learning disabilities in Black children within the US. And one of the organizations that they mentioned was the Brookings Institute. And the Brookings Institute is a nonprofit based in the US, and they fund research in a lot of different areas. And they have done some research on learning disabilities in the Black community. And what they have found is that there is a significant issue with disproportionality of Black students in special education. So essentially what's happening is that students of color are less likely than their white peers to be appropriately identified with a learning disability, and they are more likely to be given a diagnosis of either intellectual disability or having an emotional or behavioral disability, rather than the correct disability that matches kind of how they're presenting. So they're less likely to be diagnosed with a learning disability such as dyslexia.
And piggybacking off of what Clarissa just said, absolutely. I think there's a lot of I think families and like especially lay people who also don't understand the difference between an intellectual disability and a learning disability. They equate it to almost being the same thing. So that also could include even, unfortunately, teachers, if they're not properly trained to actually recognize that, hey, this may be actually a learning disability and not an intellectual one, which actually has more restrictions in the capacity to improve on learning. Learning disabilities, especially things like dyslexia, however, if they're diagnosed and caught on at an early age, even if they're caught later on in life, at any time in life, with the proper resources, someone can have the same capacity to succeed in whatever it is that they want to pursue. They don't necessarily need to have limitations being put on their life or their choices in whatever it is that they want to learn about, or whatever it is that they want to pursue, whether that be academically or career wise. So yeah.
I mean, that's a very, you two brought up two of the very, I think the very two systems that could actually have labeled dyslexia or learning disability properly, and that is from the education system, which is an early stage. And then Clarissa talked about disproportionality even within the research. I'm also very familiar with Brookings Institutes because they do a lot of those kind of like great research, and it's good to know that at least from the research side, it's being studied and it's being examined for especially not just like Black communities, I think, also for marginalized communities in that sense. So, which leads me to the second, I guess, the follow-up question to both of you is, in terms of the education system, considering learning disabilities can be detected at an early age, like Hodan said, do you think that it's systemically ingrained through schools that learning disabilities are more prevalent in white people because the system clearly favors white children?
So I would say that this is quite a complicated challenge. So from my professional experiences, I certainly see that there's a systemic aspect of the lack of identification of Black students and students in other marginalized communities as well that have disabilities. And I think that part of this has to do with the representation in the classroom of different minorities. So in the 2017 to 2018 school year, the Pew Research Organization performed a study, and they found that only 7% of public school teachers in the United States identified as Black. And that number certainly does not represent the proportion of students in our public schools that are Black. And studies have shown that having a Black educator as a Black child in elementary school significantly increases the likelihood of academic success. And so I think that even in the lack of representation of Black teachers, this does not do justice to Black students, and it does them a disservice as it relates to their learning and their ability to be identified early for having a learning disability.
In terms of like the research that is available right now, especially in regards to race and learning disabilities or race and anything mental health related, there are definitely a lot more, I think, studies as well as information in the United States in comparison to Canada. There's like, there aren't as many, unfortunately, there's not as many organizations in Canada that are specifically created or tailored towards people of color or minorities in general. And I think that's because there's this kind of this incorrect thinking that race is not necessarily an issue in Canada, whereas the media plays into and highlights larger race disparities and larger racial issues that happen in America versus Canadians are painted as being more polite and less likely to be racist. And some people always think that like racism is like a deliberate thing only, and unfortunately sometimes it can come from things like not understanding what are the statistics, and lack of training of teachers, whether they be of teachers of color or like teachers like of white teachers, right? So that makes it harder to figure out what services that are available in Canada. It means lack of services altogether, actually. And from my research and from personal experience of people in the community who have tried to reach out and find services to assist with their children, and maybe they get referred from by the teachers that are saying, I think your child is having issues with learning. We don't know what exactly the problem is. And from there onwards, family members aren't really given a lot of support on what to do next or what steps to take next. They also don't have access to like a one size. There's no such thing as a one size fit all solution, first of all. But those issues definitely make it a bit harder for them to access possible testing. In Canada, the testing is also done differently. You have to be tested according to the DSM specifications by a psychologist. So you usually need to get like a psychoeducational assessment. And the psychoeducational assessment that is provided, there's usually psychologists provided by schools, the school board, that you can be referred to, but wait lists, I think even just a few years ago, some wait lists were over 2 years long. So could you imagine, like, you're a child who may be potentially struggling to learn, and now you have to wait in this ridiculously long wait list just to get an assessment. You've lost, many years of, your education, not getting the services that you need. And overall, the DSM itself has even changed. The DSM-5 has even changed its criteria of what a learning disability is. And that was as recently as 2013. So there's a lot of, not only are teachers maybe misrepresenting or misinterpreting certain behaviors of students, but even doctors themselves and trained physicians or trained, highly educated healthcare professionals may not always be equipped to properly diagnose, properly identify, and then kids kind of fall through the cracks and can't access services until much later. So yeah.
I mean, I think you both said a lot of really, really, you highlighted a lot of really intricate issues that underlines not just within systemically, but also from the person that represents the system. And, when you said 7%, Clarice, I was actually shocked just because you want to be able to get the access with a person that you identify with. So if I was to see someone who looks like me, I'm more likely to be able to express myself in terms of the issues that I'm having. But then, Hodan, you also talked about how, race is seen not, it's not seen as an issue, which is a typical thing to kind of do that one model fits all approach, which I think shows a prevalent in an issue in the system that is already facilitated to cater to everybody. But then, like you say, that if there is a 2 to 3 years of a wait list, the system itself is also not functioning the way it should. So, I can see a lot of holes, and it's interesting because we're talking about two of the most developed countries in the world, where, I'm sure they pride themselves in having all these accesses to everybody, doing this intersectionality between mental health and different type of services. I too work in a mental health service casually where often asked, is there a language speaker for this person? Because I don't understand what they're trying to tell me. And then, coming from where I come from, I'm from Ethiopia, and I've had people from my background, which is even interesting to see because we never thought, just learning from my parents, even that, mental health was not even considered an issue. It's not even understood from the community perspective. And so when you see people that are there to get help, often they don't know how to express themselves, or they don't feel comfortable because what is in front of them is a white doctor or someone that's not of their background. So there's also the ethnicity aspect, ethnicity layer, which is beneath the racial layer to it. So I can only imagine if, like Hodan said, which is accurate, is that, race is not a problem. I don't see color type of thing. That also really delineates people from ever wanting to enter that access or wanting to have that service as well. So even in my experience, when I'm booking a language service or when I'm trying to help someone, because I know where I'm from in terms of I know how that person could be understood or how that person could be serviced properly, but they do the one model fits approach where we're going to give them this type of care, and maybe that's not the support they need. It could be like a community thing, because there's also such thing as a communal access, or a communal help, or or a spiritual thing. But this is not for dyslexia or a learning disability. This is for other less adverse sides of or topics of mental health. So I find it very interesting that you both highlighted the very same thing that also exists even within a mental health care facility, which is amazing that you both brought it up. So
I just wanted to add the cost of a psychoeducational assessment right now in the province of Ontario, if you were to do the private route. So if you've got the money, which not a lot of persons of colors or minorities may have access to the funds, it costs approximately $4,500 to get a psychoeducational assessment.
Wow.
So, and even when you pay for it privately, there's still a wait list. There's still, I think right now, as recently as 2021 and 2022, there is depending on what clinic you get you approach, there's approximately a 6 month to 8 month wait list, even for the private funds that you will be paying out of pocket for. That unfortunately, on top of that, a lot of insurance companies actually don't cover. I've had community members who even had their own work insurance. It's not covered by OHIP
Mhm.
even though it's for children. In Canada, we have like healthcare that's like it's supposed to be universal healthcare. It covers so many things: dental care, eye care. But when it comes to like mental health services, or it comes to learning, getting assessment for learning potential learning disabilities, just to get that identification is so difficult to accomplish. So imagine if you do have a member who is potentially, working multiple jobs, or trying to, a newcomer who may not, speak the language, who may not have the ability to constantly go after and recheck and make sure that they're getting access to, that private health facility. Even if they came up with the money, it's still difficult to have to wait as long and pay that total amount. The person that I know did have health care, and their insurance was only going to be covering, I think, up to $500 for the assessment. That's barely a dent. You still have to pay $4,000 out of pocket, right? So that just makes it that much more difficult to access it. And I think CBC even did like in Hamilton, Ontario, they did a few years ago a story on that, where like a family member was basically kind of really upset about their lack of access to being able to get their child tested, even though they could tell, and the teachers could also all agreed that there was an issue, and they could all kind of understand what the potential issue was. They had a feeling that it was most likely dyslexia. There are screening services that teachers can implement, as well as like early childhood educators. That is like an informal process where they can kind of determine what is the most likely issue that the child is maybe experiencing at that time. And but beyond that, they can't get the official diagnosis until the psychologist gives them a full assessment and says, yes, absolutely, this is what this person has. And even then, there's also on top of that the Ontario education system has its own definition on top of that of who meets the criteria. So
Mhm.
it's not enough for a psychologist to also diagnose. They also have to meet the criteria according to the education system, which isn't always the same criteria that healthcare services use. So it's there's a lot of like red tape that people have to like, and a lot of hoops that they have to jump through just to get the proper like diagnosis and get the proper label, and then they can have access to those extra services that can aid them in the future. So it's really bizarre when you look into it. And I even looked up like learning disability groups potentially in Canada. They're all very general. There aren't any that are specifically for Black people. There are mental health services um, groups and mental health groups for Black people as well as people of minority backgrounds, um, but nothing specific to actual learning disabilities, which I thought was very interesting. I think the company that I was looking at was it's a substance abuse program for African Canadian and Caribbean youth. It's called SAPACI, I guess. Like it has like a really long acronym. And it provides mental health and addiction services to Black children and youth under 25. And care is provided through a cultural competence lens to address the lived experience of Black youth in confronting mental health and addiction challenges. Even though they kind of have a bit of an intersection with like mental health can kind of intersect with learning disabilities.
Right.
Learning disabilities are their own thing altogether and need to be addressed separately um, of actual mental health
Yeah,
challenges.
you can't be amalgamated into something else. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, exactly. Like it's not the same thing. Like not being able to unfortunately treat learning disabilities can definitely like turn into a mental health issue though. And if you're not really targeting the root problem, which is not getting access to services, then it's kind of, we're catching it too late. We're trying to fix it from the back end, then trying to mitigate the risk factors and mitigate the actual underlying issues, which is like lack of access and lack of yeah.
Yeah, it's almost like working backwards. Yeah, no, for sure. I think, Clarissa, I guess in your experience as well in that case, especially with the healthcare system, of course, Canada has a universal health, like Hodan said, but there's a lot of special services that are actually just as crucial as, go getting aid. I mean, it's still wonderful to have that access. Just go to the emergency, and if you have a symptom of something, to go and be able to have access to it. But with special type of special care needed, diseases, or even like learning disabilities. How is the healthcare system in the States in addressing that?
Sure. So I certainly see where there's disparity in the States as well, because obviously in the States, we don't have the same sort of healthcare system as in Canada. And one of the things that I see is that a lot of individuals that I work with may not have access to private healthcare. And in a way, this ties directly to early identification of language disorders and learning disabilities. Because here in the States, a lot of physicians will ask questions to parents that provide like a basic language and speech screener. And what we know is that children with language disorders are more likely to have a learning disability. And so we know that in our Black community, there's a lot of individuals that don't have healthcare, access to healthcare. And so they're not able to take their kids to regular pediatrician visits. And so their child doesn't have necessarily a pediatrician overseeing their kind of language and speech development. And so the parent may not have kind of a reference to know if their child is struggling or not. And so they may not be able to access services for early intervention because they didn't have that same access to a pediatrician at a young age. And then, so within our school system in the Dallas area, all students have the right to a full evaluation. So a lot of times what will happen is if a teacher notices concerns, a teacher will refer a child to be evaluated, but parents also have the right to start that evaluation process. And usually districts will have an evaluation team that goes around to different schools, or they might have their own evaluators within the school. And so they will evaluate that child from there. But as was mentioned, the evaluation process can take some time. And there's a long wait list. And I see this especially with students that are bilingual or even trilingual, because it's important to evaluate students in the languages that they speak. And so if there's not someone on the evaluation team that speaks that language, I think that language barrier can be a big challenge, because you have to have an interpreter. And that's really important that the parents and the child are able to have the same experience of being evaluated as a child that's monolingual.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it goes like earlier, like I said, when I was talking about how I was booking interpreters, if someone is not going to be able to be serviced in the language of not just their choice, but also in language that they feel comfortable in, then they're also not going to be able to express themselves in exactly what the root of the problem is that they're going through. So it's really interesting to see that disparity as well exist in the States just as much as in Canada. So we have these services. I know this is kind of like within the realm of what we're discussing, but we have all these services. And like I said earlier, the school system, I mean, that's where it starts, right? It's hard to go backwards. Like Kodan said, you may have a great organization that tailors to addiction for Black youth and also mental health. But then, like Kodan said, it leads to, not having the issue dealt with at a young age could lead to potential mental health problems. But then if there are these disparities that are existing in terms of like language, like you said, Clarissa, I think there is a gap there. There seems to be red tapes everywhere. There seems to be gaps everywhere. And if this is, more prevalent in Black communities, I guess from both your experiences as, with different health with different health backgrounds. What is it that is it a communal issue? Is it that there's a socioeconomic component that was highlighted earlier, that if it costs this much, then that person's more likely not going to go and get this access. There's also a wait list associated with that cost. So where can we start in terms of saying, there's a problem within our community to look into this, and what can we do to kind of push for, or is it a systemic problem? Should we, reach out to the system to say that it's there, but it's not enough, and you need to acknowledge it? So what do you guys think in that sense?
I think that we should definitely be probably addressing things at different levels. It is absolutely a systemic issue. In terms of like language barriers, Canada right now is notorious for accepting a lot of and promoting immigration to Canada. Our population's not that big considering how big our country is. And we also have like an aging population in general. So yeah, right now, according to the Council of Ontario Directors of Education, they completed a research on like for example, ESL needs or supports in place right now in the Canadian school systems. So there's an increasing number of English language learners in Ontario English and elementary and secondary schools, and over 50% of newcomers come to Ontario, Canada, but school systems are not changing to meet the requirements or needs needed for ESL instruction and services. And a research paper written by Anna Rzepika, I'm pronouncing that wrong, from the University of Windsor, has found that over the years, Ontario has actually decreased its ESL services, even though there's like an influx of more English language learners. They're actually decreasing services, which doesn't really, like the math isn't mathing. It's not adding up, right?
The gap is only like widening further. Yeah.
Exactly. So I think doing more research on it, highlighting it, educating not only the public, but also, I guess, making leaders accountable, and trying to figure out, like, why is it that people can't access services? Why are we lacking these type of services, right? So in Ontario, just give you a few statistics. So 29% of the population is foreign born in the province right now. And it's the province, by the way, with the largest population in Canada. And as of 2017, 63% of Ontario's elementary and 58% of secondary schools had English language learners. So people who had English as a second potential language. In comparatively, however, only 38% of English language elementary schools had ESL teachers. So they don't even have, forget ESL, proper ESL programs, that some of them don't even have ESL teachers. And again, also comparatively, only 20% of elementary and 31% of secondary schools have no formal process of even identifying what is considered like an ESL student. So it's unfortunate because like literacy is a civil right and no one should leave the school system as an illiterate person. But the chances of that happening, unfortunately, are going to be a lot higher if you can't even identify, between different issues. You can't identify between, what is a mental, health, like mental health problem versus an actual, like just like a language barrier versus a learning disability. So if there aren't services to kind of, through process of elimination, even assess other issues that a person might be having, then it's kind of, it just makes everyone's job that much harder. And yeah, it can cause frustration on every level for the families, for the children, unfortunately. And yeah, a lot of things are starting to slowly improve in terms of categorizing what learning disabilities are and that kind of thing. But it's not really, not a lot of older doctors, some even older doctors may not be up to date on the information because a lot of these definitions are nuanced and constantly changing. Ways to assess them are constantly changing. and not everybody is staying with the times, and our systems that are in place are definitely not keeping up with whatever trends that are occurring and showing up in the population currently. So, yeah.
I think it certainly starts with educating ourselves because, as was mentioned, I agree that a lot of it does rest on kind of systemic changes, but also on us as professionals providing quality information to the public about the disparity that does exist. And that starts with educating ourselves. And some of the things that we notice as in terms of disparity are not necessarily explicitly taught in the programs we have gone through. So the responsibility lies on us to go and educate ourselves on these topics that we may not have had exposure to. I will say that I've kind of been in a good situation in my program where there have been classes that have explicitly kind of discussed what it looks like to work with children that are English language learners or that are trilingual or bilingual. And I think that it's important for professors and educators to be educating the next generation of educators and clinicians on these topics. And I think that that's a great way to kind of start promoting changes in these areas. And then also, social media is a very powerful tool. I think that social media is a great way to connect with the community and to connect with parents, and even empowering parents to advocate for their children. Because when it comes to the whole process of diagnosis with language disorders or learning disabilities, it really can be a complicated process. And I think that, parents can kind of feel lost in this process. So we as professionals can provide quality research backed information to kind of guide them as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you both talked about the institutional change that needs to happen, but also from the education perspective. And also, it's our individual responsibility to even not just teach the generation that we're in, but also the future generation as well. And also to go backwards and teach our parents as well, so that they're aware of the things they never thought they could have diagnosed or they could have been aware of. I think it skipped their generation. It's certainly just because of the unknowing. And I think Hudan, we talked about the ESL component because Clarissa was talking about how people with multilingual abilities, if they're not diagnosed properly in their language of their choice, I think language seems to be very, very crucial, because with language comes understanding. I remember I learned Spanish at school, and I understand a lot more things about the culture and the people that I did way before I spoke it. So I think it also opens the doors to, it opens your mind, and it opens your understanding to a different level, because you're looking beyond race. You're looking beyond the point of understanding the person, but you're also understanding who they are through how they speak and how they act and how they react. So I think it's a certain tenets to have, and it's a good point that you said, Clarissa, that professors should definitely educate, and even though the system's constantly changing, and of course social media, which I'm also seeing that there's a lot of mental health advocates. There's a lot of advocates for all types of degrees of mental health right now. But even within that realm, I always find it interesting that there's not a lot for Black communities, because I do search these trends to say, oh, does it exist for Black communities? Does it exist for marginalized groups in general, people of color? So but at least it's on the rise, that it's getting there, and there's a lot of Black mental health services, but it's catered to just Black mental health, and it's mental health is kind of, it's generic, right? Because there's the different complexities within it that we all understand. But like you said, it could be educational, it could be an individual thing, it could also be a systemic change. So as much as we rely on these three different pillars, or the various pillars that surround dyslexia and learning disabilities within the area of mental health, I think if we also need to make those connections, I think, not just as individuals, not just as a practitioner or a nurse educator, but also as an advocate to say that, it's absolutely crucial that we should have that individual awareness, but we should also have that individual learning and teaching, and continue to foster that awareness through our community. So I guess the next question would be for Hodan. I guess in your experience as a healthcare professional, and a nurse educator, what are the common trends among not only Black people, but marginalized communities um, with respect to learning disabilities and dyslexia? Like, what are the trends that you see even from the community perspective?
So some of the articles that were published in the US that actually did talk about the percentage of students who are actually diagnosed with learning disabilities overall. I believe it has increased from like 93 to the 2000s, but not by a lot. I think on average between it was about 6% before in 1993 of students were diagnosed with a learning disability. And I think it was about 2017. Oh, no, sorry, in 2007, it increased to 6.9 students. So they are increasing a little bit, but considering the fact that Clarissa mentioned that 1 in 5 students actually most likely has a learning disability, that still means there's a lot of people who are just not getting the proper diagnosis that they're supposed to be getting. They're not getting the assistance they're supposed to be getting. And as a result, it's impacting their futures, their future families, their ability to succeed. Um, so those are some of the trends, and unfortunately, as a result of that, um, I've seen actually personal situations where people I've known who were people of color and who were new immigrants to Canada, whose children were automatically diagnosed as having, for example, like a learning disability when there was in fact a language barrier. And fast forward many years later, those same children, the parents luckily were able to stick up for their kids and tell the teacher. They did something very interesting that they did to the principal. They actually brought a book in their own language and gave it to the principal and said, "Can you read this to prove a point?" And the principal was like, "No, I can't read it." And then the father said, "Okay, well, you're disabled then." So and it just goes to show, like, just because someone doesn't speak the language that is predominant in the culture, or they're a newcomer, doesn't necessarily mean um, that they may have a learning disability. Fast forward many years later, the same students that, like, the parents actually pulled them out of that school, put them in a new school altogether because of the incident, and because they felt that their children weren't receiving the proper services they needed. They eventually integrated well. They got, a bit of tutoring help at the beginning just to get their English up to like speed. And once their English was at like a normal, acceptable level, then they not only did they, they weren't even just average, they excelled. And they even, ended up going to post-secondary institutions on full ride scholarships. So like above average learners, right? Um, Another trend that I see is, unfortunately, there are also incidents of, like, within communities, like Clarissa also mentioned, of like miseducation and misunderstanding of what it means to have a learning disability, right? So if we as a community within ourselves have our leaders and our own healthcare providers, they do definitely need to educate people of color as well as new immigrants on what it means to have a learning disability, and the fact that a learning disability isn't going to necessarily mean that their child is not able to succeed in life. That's a very common misconception. Oh, I'm disabled, so therefore I can't do this or I can't do that, which is not true. When you are from a marginalized community, you also have to worry about labels in general, right? So you're already being seen, from a societal standpoint as a certain type of person, and you are, Black person might be less likely to want to have their child to have any type of label, out of fear of that. Hey, if my kid gets labeled, how is this going to work against their potential future? And how is this going to hinder their future success, right? So sometimes it's like, I'd rather not know than or pretend like that's not a real thing, kind of a thing, like almost kind of a denial. Um, Whereas I feel like people who are like naturally like maybe from privileged backgrounds, they might actually understand that, hey, getting my child this early diagnosis actually is going to give them access to more help, and it's not going to affect them in the future because maybe they've had family members who've gone through the same thing and succeeded and got access to all of the things that they needed to get access to and not have any difficulties based on like potential racial biases and stuff like that too, right? Having other, if you don't have other barriers, you're less likely, I think, to have like a trauma response to potential labels. Um, and learning disabilities are actually found to be genetic, so they run in families, especially dyslexia. It runs in families. It's something you're born with. And I think another thing that like people of like people of color may not realize is that they might see their child having a learning disability as a parenting fail and not understand that it's not anything that the parent did or did not do. It's a developmental issue, or it's a developmental challenge. I don't want to call it an issue. It's just a different type of brain. It's their brain literally thinks in a different way. It learns in a different way, but it still has the capacity to learn. Um, and there's some like a little bit of research that I was doing before our meeting today on like a few famous people who have actually been diagnosed as dyslexic, according to the Mayo Clinic. I'm just trying to find my list here, if I can find it. But like Albert Einstein, for example, like he had issues with learning. He had issues with school. One of the smartest people
And he was kicked out of
historically, I
high
think.
school, wasn't he? Yeah, because he was a troubled child. And
Yeah, and that's like kind of like something that does happen. And Clarissa mentioned that like if kids don't get the assistance they need and they feel like, no matter what I do, I still can't learn properly, then they're gonna act out. And that's just human nature. Like if you feel like, you're trying your best and nothing you do is helping, and you're being, at that point, your other option is to act out and try other things to get attention and maybe potentially look like you have behavioral problems, when the root of the cause, again, no one's addressing the actual root of the cause, and they're not getting assistance for the root of the cause. um, Jennifer Aniston. So she was diagnosed also in her 20s. So these are like a lot of older, like famous people. And a lot of them also were diagnosed at a later age. They didn't figure it out till they were like late adults. And unfortunately, a lot of them still recall and talk about how they now link a lot of their childhood traumas to the fact that they did have a learning disability that wasn't. Unfortunately identified at a younger age. And some of these people are people who maybe not, even though they didn't have access to potentially getting the assistance they needed, they did have other privileges, right? And they didn't have other things that might have been holding them back. American film director, producer, and screenwriter Steven Spielberg, he didn't know till he was 60 that he was dyslexic, right? Um, very accomplished, obviously, like person. Whoopi Goldberg, a comedian, also bullied, and found out later on I guess she dropped out of school, and that's when she found out what exactly was her challenge. And she's like one of the few people who've earned like, an Emmy, Grammy, Oscar, and Tony Awards, or um, and also legendary heavyweight boxer Muhammad Ali. So also, and people still quote him till this day, right? Sting, fly like a butterfly, sting like a bee, and a bunch of other really amazing quotes that he's made. May God rest his soul. So yeah, so there's a bunch of, I don't want to go through all the lists, but from billionaires to different types of business moguls to entertainers, like having a learning disability it's not going to limit you. And I think until we start talking about that and we take the shame out of it, it's going to be hard to address it.
Definitely. I think you highlighted a lot of important points there, Hodan. I think from the community perspective, like you said, we already have enough labels as is and enough problems being labeled, mislabeled, stigmatized, marginalized on a daily basis. So we have to put up with that face. So I think we feel like I certainly would have. Not anymore, but I think just because it's one of those things where, well, I too am a person, regardless of who I am in society. And if I'm facing a challenge, I'm going to go have that access. But I think even to get there as an individual, as an educated individual, imagine for the communities that barely have the time to even survive, let alone have, because I feel like even getting these accesses is a privilege, even with a privileged society, like you said, a lot of them are diagnosed late. I think could also be because of the, historically we didn't even acknowledge mental health. I think we called it alienism, like in the 1920s or something. If there was something wrong with you, if you're troubled, you're not considered normal, so you are labeled as an alien, which is also interesting to see now. Even my unit where I work, we used to be called a psychiatry unit, so everybody used to, immediately get alerted and get goosebumps and just go, oh, that locked up unit. And now it's called mental health. So even the transformation of the wording really changes the perspective in which you see abnormalities or abnormal conditions that people get treatment for. So I guess if we're not willing to go and get the access because of pride and shame, there's also cultural context to it too, right? Because you don't acknowledge something, you're prideful, and you may not even want to go to these services. So I guess, Clarissa, in your experience as a graduate speech clinician, have you come across Black people coming in and asking for assistance for learning disabilities?
So I certainly do see families coming in and asking for assistance with language disorders and learning disabilities. And in my experience, often some of the reasons that parents may come in is because they feel that their child is falling behind academically. They may be exhibiting distractible behaviors in class, which we know can occur if a child is frustrated with not being able to
Right.
kind of pick up on what they're learning academically. They may be struggling with reading or writing, or they may be delayed in their language in comparison to their peers in some aspects. So whether that's kind of the form of their language, the content of their language, so things like vocabulary development and things of that nature. And I will say I also see that some parents are also hesitant in seeking support for their child. And I think that this comes from a number of sources. I think stigma is certainly a large part of why parents may be hesitant. And I think there's also this kind of there's this reality that Black individuals are often labeled with
Right.
different things. And so I think that a lot of times it's easy to internalize the fear of being labeled as having a language disability or a learning disability. And I think that a lot of parents may kind of be reluctant to seek that support, especially when they don't see representation in the professionals that are providing support to their children.
Mm-hmm.
And then another thing that I've seen is that parents from all demographics seem to sometimes have the misconception that they should use the wait and see method, for lack of better words, essentially seeing if their child's performance kind of improves, even though they've seen a recurrent pattern of their child kind of struggling academically or with reading or writing or with their language. And I completely understand where this thought process comes from. However, from my professional experience and from research, we know that it is always appropriate to seek out an evaluation when you see concerns and not wait it out. We know that there is great importance in kind of this early intervention aspect of working with children with language and learning disabilities. And so I think that as a professional, one thing that I try to do is, educate parents on the evaluation process to kind of ease their concerns. And even I think it's great to have a reference of, individuals that have been successful with learning disabilities, because I think that there's a grieving process that parents may go through when their child is diagnosed with a learning disability, and they may feel that their child cannot achieve things in the future. And I think it's important for us as clinicians to be sensitive to this, first of all, and to not kind of be dismissive of the concerns that the parent has, but to kind of counsel them from our scope of practice, of course, and help them through this process.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good point. It's what Hodan said earlier about taking the shame out and, and assuring them that they are getting the services that they need. But also, you're absolutely right. I think especially Black communities, we like this wait and see approach just because, first of all, it's that thing. Even I say it when I'm sick with something, I'm like, I'll just wait it out a couple of days, let alone parents with their child, because I don't want to say acknowledge, but they don't want to convince themselves, or they don't want to sense the reality that there is something wrong, even though they see it, it's right there. So it's good that educated brilliant minds like you women are there to kind of be aware of not just the child's problem, but also acknowledging what the parents are going through. And there's not enough grieving process for that, especially when a parent is told that, it's because I think they see it as there's something wrong with my child, where as professionals, you guys see it as, well, there's a symptom and we want to treat the symptom. And I think with Black communities, it's often seen as there's something wrong with me, there's something wrong with my child. And that diagnosis in and of itself could harm not just a parent, but also the child. And a lot of the things that you brought up earlier about misdiagnosis, and you can, imagine as an adult, like for me as a 45-year-old lady, down the road, I'm told, oh, this is not what you had. If you were properly diagnosed, it could have been this. So that years of decoupling, deconstructing that, because it could have created, future mental health problems. What would I know, right? And I think it would really have to be, it's important to acknowledge, and you both did it, that it's not just when we're treating the child, we're also helping the parent navigating through the process of how to also cope with it for themselves, but also how to teach their child how to learn with that, how to live with that in a sense of, this is the special services they need, and this is the kind of services you can provide for them as a parent, because, your parents would do anything for you. So I think it's really important that you're being sensitive to, also catering to what that parent is going through. And I think it's very crucial. So I guess my next question kind of lead up to that in terms of the access is this question to both of you. Is there a lack of awareness among Black communities when it comes to recognizing learning disabilities? I think we answered a little bit, but to kind of broaden it a bit more. And if so, what can be done about it, or who's responsible for presenting communities with such awareness?
Sure. So I certainly think that there is a lack of awareness amongst the Black community, and perhaps this is because of the stigma around learning disabilities.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that awareness is certainly important in this space. And from my perspective, it starts with creating comfortable spaces for conversations about disabilities.
Mm-hmm.
So I've seen a lot of organizations come to be in the past couple of years, including organizations like Black Mental Health Matters, Dyslexia Alliance for Black Children. There's another organization called Therapy for Black Girls, amongst others, that are starting to talk about these conversations. And that can make a great deal of change as it relates to spreading awareness. As it relates to responsibility, I believe that a lot of the responsibility lies on educators and other clinicians, such as diagnosticians and speech language pathologists, to educate the public. But I also believe that anyone who's passionate about education, mental health, and advocacy can start these conversations in their own circles to promote awareness. A lot of change can start in person-to-person conversations, and you never know how your one interaction with someone can change their perspective, and they can change their perspective, and then kind of it can be a flow chain reaction of people changing their perspectives on these things. And so I think that starting conversation is very important.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely agree. And I think like even us discussing this, it's kind of proudful to even see that three different types of educated women with different fields to be able to discuss about this when we didn't even have the space to do so just only like a few years ago. So I think it's incredible. And you're right, it starts with conversations, because conversations, that's how we create that ripple effect and making that change happen. And I wasn't even aware of the two other accounts talked about besides the mental health awareness. So it's really great to see that even within within a different realm of layer of mental health, that is also being discussed among Black communities. So it's really nice to see. And Hodan, do you have anything else to add to Clarissa's points?
Um, Only that, like, another thing that I came across was in the United States, in comparison to Canada, where you have to have a clinician to diagnose dyslexia. They're starting to have teachers actually trained to help assess certain learning disabilities. Now, I would need to do more research on whether that could be potentially a good thing or a bad thing. I think there definitely needs to be studies done on, if whether that's actually helpful versus harmful. In which communities does it actually help versus, and how accurate the tests are when they're not done by, like, for example, like a trained psychologist, and what the assessment skills that are provided to some of these teachers may be. Here in Canada, there is a Manitoba school that's also started implementing universal screening. So I think that's absolutely amazing because it's not really singling out any one child. And considering the fact that, like, learning disabilities are actually underrepresented and statistically are probably more prevalent, doing something like that that's very universal would allow things to be maybe caught early on in life. Um, and yeah, just basically like allow parents to not feel like their children are being singled out. So it's not, we just picked on your kid because we didn't understand how he was acting. We did this universal screen on all the children in the classroom at a certain age, and we noticed that there were some challenges your child has. What does that mean moving forward? Being careful about the language used, because unfortunately, even here in Canada, some teachers do use inappropriate language when communicating with parents, especially parents of color or immigrant parents, which may indicate maybe a underlying racial bias that they're not even aware of. It might not be something that they're trying to, um, portray, but it might be something that's kind of like below the surface. And parents can be very sensitive to that and shut down completely, and not really trust the educator beyond that point. Because if an educator is just slamming your child, and your kid is more than whatever this teacher is telling you, or more than the behavioral issues that the teacher is pointing out, or the verbiage that they're using is inappropriate, that can be very disheartening. I've had a close colleague of mine had issues with a child of hers who was recently diagnosed with ADHD, and the teacher was like, "Oh, he's so spacey," and the way the teacher was teaching him, and like basically talking about the son to the mom, completely like turned her off completely from and made her realize, like, this teacher really almost even dislikes my son or is very irritated. And as educators, you have to kind of try to, as best as you can, not only leave your bias at the door, but be very careful about how you comment on certain things and how you communicate what observations that you are making, and realize that it's very difficult for parents to receive certain information as is. So you have to be that much more sensitive about what you say and how you treat the children, because I think he was talking a lot and doing a lot of things, I guess, being very busy in class. So the teacher even removed the student from the classroom. By the way, this is a kid in grade 1 child. They're all, yeah, she removed him from the classroom and had him eating outside in the hall by himself, lunch. This is in Ottawa.
That's disheartening.
Um, it is. And like the kid told his mom, and the worst part of it all was the teacher didn't have a communication with the parent outwardly. Like, the child told their mom first, and then after the fact, the teacher had the conversation and was like, "Oh, well, he's spacey. He's, making a mess everywhere, and disrupting all the other students." And so it just made it look like kind of like a blame, and not coming from like a compassionate, caring place. Um, placing a lot of blame on this child who is clearly very young. And at that age, they're all kind of, in my opinion, out of control and very hard to redirect. Um, and and then later on, once the principal was like involved in it, the way the teacher changed the way she described the situation completely changed altogether. And it's kind of unfortunate because it's like, why couldn't she have communicated what she was saying to the parents at that time? Because at that point, it makes it look like, okay, she feels like she's in trouble now. So now she's trying to kind of make it seem a little bit more palatable to the principal and make it look like she was actually doing it in the best interest of the child versus like she just wasn't equipped to handle the situation.
I mean, it's really disheartening because these are the kind of things that you only come across in knowing when a child's going through it. And, it's a good thing that the child spoke up, because there was also instances where the child may be inept to talk about it, and that could cause potential future problems. But, one thing about kids is, of course, not all kids are the same, but they're outspoken at that age. So when you want to encourage them to be as outspoken as possible. And I know I tell my nieces and nephews, everything that happens, every detail, every air you breathe, tell me, because then if I see, God forbid, any like tiny little thing that they're being treated or a little microaggression is thrown into their innocent minds, then it should be addressed properly, of course. And it's really unfortunate because on one hand, we're saying we should educate the teachers, we should give them proper training in detecting it. But if they're going to misdiagnose it, then the speech clinician is going to say, well, this is not the actual diagnosis, this is what. So that could take years too, depending on the access. So there's a lot of these loopholes that we have to navigate through, and it's a lot harder for Black people than it is for white folks, because we talked about earlier, it's more prevalent in white communities to be diagnosed properly because the system that is created is catered to them for so many years, right? So it's kind of unfortunate. But I guess this question is to both of you. So how can a Black parent detect a learning disability or dyslexia in their children, and what can they do about it? From as a speech clinician and as a nurse educator, what's your take on it? How should one parent detect such issues in their children?
Sure. So if you see your child is struggling in reading, language, or other school subjects, or if they're exhibiting anxiety in the classroom, in the United States, you have the right to ask for your child to be evaluated. Now, oftentimes, if a teacher identifies a child as struggling, the teacher will then refer for an evaluation. But if a parent has concerns, they always have the right to start this process. And as I mentioned previously, we know based on research that it is better to seek early intervention for most children than to kind of wait and see. And I think it's also important how parents and professionals kind of navigate talking to their child about, the evaluation process and what that looks like. There was a child that I was working with, and child was recently diagnosed with dyslexia, and the child told me that they could not be successful in life because they had dyslexia. And that just was really heartbreaking to me. And children hear everything that we say, and they hear everything we do not say. They notice things, and they're very attentive to the emotions of others and the perceptions of others. And so we can unintentionally pass our own biases along to our children. And so I think it's very important to be very careful with how we, talk to our children and navigate these issues. But obviously, every parent has to kind of navigate that and choose, what they think is best for their child, and, trust their own parental instincts on that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're right. Children do mimic everything, and they're a lot more intuitive to people's emotions, let alone their own emotions. So being sensitive around that, of course, is challenging for the parents as well, because like you said, we can exhibit that into them. But I think it's very crucial that we should also, like I said, hear everything they say, but also see everything they do. And that communication is certainly helpful. Hodan, do you want to add to that?
No, I think that Clarissa tied it up really well there. Yeah, we just have to try our best. And again, just try to make sure that people are as educated as possible.
No, definitely. I think these two topics, and I'm glad that it was, dyslexia is its own thing, and learning disabilities. Of course, we didn't discuss the variations that exist within there. It's its own topic in and of its own. And when you talked about the Brookings Institute, it's an amazing research community, because I studied climate change, and I got a lot of my research from there. So it's really nice to see that at least they're doing some sort of cross-sectional studies with marginalized groups, and also helps the research better, because like we talked about, one model does not fit all, and it was created to fit a certain community, and then it just never evolved, or it's changing but it's not addressing enough. And systemically it's there, but it needs to be broadened a bit more. And when you talked about the universal way of classifying it, I'm thinking of like 196 nations in the world, God knows how many languages and how many ethnic groups and what it's addressing. I see the benefits, but I'm also thinking in terms of it's a good step, but also we have to, being cautious about the labeling of universal, and me thinking, well, they can address, this person's language, so I'm going to put that person there, right? So, but at least we're headed in the direction of doing intersectionalities within the race context, within the ethnic context, within the language. And I think the one thing we talked about the most is language. And even understanding a person's language, like I said, could open doors to that person's mind, and that person is certainly willing to open up to you and talk willingly about what they're, and it may not even be a problem. So a lot of the misdiagnosis, Clarissa, I think when he said 1 in 5, it's alarming. Because you wouldn't think it would just be 1 in 5. I don't think it was that before, but not enough research was done before. Like, I think it ties into even Odan, what you said about a lot of, yes, privileged people were diagnosed at a later stage because we didn't have enough services, or we didn't even discuss these kind of things openly because we had that shame context, or not enough services enough, that a lot of people were diagnosed a lot late. But and I guess my last question to both of you, based on your practice and your experiences, is it too late to diagnose dyslexia, or is it too late to diagnose learning disability at any stage? That would be my final question, at any stage of someone's life.
Never too late. Never too late to get help. They can get assistance at any time. Interventions that are existing today in place for people who have dyslexia can assist them at any stage of life. The difference is, if you get them earlier on, then you're not going to have to deal with as much frustration, or many years of frustration, not understanding why you're maybe different from your peers, or why you're struggling. Which will also impact, things like self-esteem, right? Mental health, potential, like meeting your actual potential, or self-actualizing. So all of these things are impacted. But in terms of when you get the assistance, doesn't matter, as long as you get the help.
I think that wrapped up everything nicely. I don't have anything to add.
Hey, no, that's wonderful. Thank you so much to both of you. That concludes our very interesting topic of dyslexia and learning disabilities within the realm of mental health. It really is, like I said, I'm very proud and happy to see not just two Black people, but two Black amazing women, educated women in a speech clinician and nurse educator and nurse as well, to see that, like I said, we don't do these things without a profound reason for them. I'm an advocate. I do work in mental health, but I'm also a climate change activist, and I also do a lot more other things. But when it comes to mental health and the various topics within it, I'm more than happy. My heart just opens up wide enough to discuss the various topics, especially amongst our communities, because we do need it. And the fact that we're opening up this space is so incredible. So very grateful to have you on the show, and hopefully we'll have you both sometime in the future as well, where there's a lot more topics. So please feel free to reach out to me or the team. Do you ladies have social media pages? And if so, you can list them. Where can people find you if they have any questions, or if they want to talk, or if they just wanted to say hi? I watched your show, and this has been great. So where can they find you?
Sure. So my Instagram that I use kind of for advocacy and kind of posting about language disorders is Mrs._G as in girl _speech.
Awesome. Hoden?
I just have personal pages. I don't have actual official social media pages. But like if anyone does want to reach out, I am on with my real name, my full name on Facebook. So you can definitely reach out, message, and I have no issue. City of Ottawa, discussing things or giving you information on where you might be able to reach out or access services, that kind of a thing.
Okay, that's great. Like I said, thank you so much for both of you for joining us on Black Mental Health Matters, and you have yourself a wonderful day.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.